Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino in our series. On this episode, we talk with author and spiritual leader Rich Lewis. Back in 2013, he began to dabble in silent prayer. He had heard and read that silence can transform one, and he wanted to experience that transformation. Centering prayer is not a race, it's a long-term marathon. It's practiced daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and it transforms all. He talks about his book and his work that examines this further, and we shared a moment in the interview that got real when I asked him how he got empirical proof of the existence of God. It's really something that was unexpected. Enjoy.
Okay, Rich, it's great to meet you. Thank you for taking a minute out to talk with me today. I appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You bet. So I think the thing that probably we should address first and foremost is the last 2 years on planet Earth has been rather strange. There's been a lot going on. How have you done during this COVID time, especially now that we're kind of looking on the back end and kind of getting back to a life that doesn't have all of these things that have included, the things that have come with COVID?
No, I mean, it's definitely been a stressful period of time. I guess, one, I'm fortunate in that my job, I remember over 2 years ago, them saying, you're going to work from home for a few weeks and we'll all be back in the office. And that never happened. I've never returned to the office, and I've since been told I don't have to return to the office. So obviously that was a big change. I worked from home about twice a week, but not permanently. So that was one big change. And then obviously COVID forced us to really take a step back and look at what can we control. So not jump into anxiety and worry and fear, because that's not going to help you. But think about what can we focus on and what actions can we take that make the most sense now to protect ourselves, protect our families and friends, etc. So I was forced to focus on that. And I think what helped me through all that is I meditate. I do a practice called centering prayer, which is really silent meditation, which I had been doing prior to that. But I think I needed that meditation practice more than ever during this time as well.
And I think that's the thing. Before we get into silent prayer and meditation, I think there's a lot of people out there that have a perception of what they think that might be meditation and being in that centered place. How would you explain that in almost layman's terms to make people understand that?
Silent prayer, my practice called centering prayer, is two things. It is considered meditation because it's silent and it's wordless and you're just sitting, but it's also considered a relationship with God. So during centering prayer, we open to the presence and actions of God within. So we let go of ourselves and we open to the presence and actions of God within. So, and I can share in a few minutes or so what is centering prayer. It's not hard to explain, but that's really how I describe centering prayer, is that it is meditation, but it's also a relationship, deepening a relationship with God, where you're opening to the presence and actions of God within, and it's wordless. So you're not praying verbally, and I'm not saying get rid of your prayer if you pray verbally. I'm just simply saying complement it with a silent practice where you're just sitting with God and letting God act in you at a deeper level beyond words and thoughts.
So explain that a little bit, because, probably for a lot of people, too, along with understanding meditation, there's a lot of people that, the common practice has been to use words when you're in that moment of prayer. So explain how you got to this point, the beginnings of you getting to a point where you grabbed onto the silent prayer and how that became a practice and why it works so well.
Sure. So I can quickly talk about how I discovered it, and then I can talk about how you do it. Back in, 2011, 2012, I was just exploring and reading a lot of books, and I came across just the idea of silence being powerful and transforming. In Carl McColman had written a number of books, so I remember him talking a lot about silence and how powerful it was. I don't remember him talking about a practice in his books. I've since learned he does practice centering prayer. So at that time, I would just sit in silence. And it was brutal, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I would just do it for a minute or a few minutes at a time. And then in late 2013, I was perusing Amazon looking for a book to read, and I decided to read Amos Smith's book called Healing the Divide, Recovering Christianity's Mystic Roots. And as I began reading his book, he talked about a practice called centering prayer that he had been doing for about 15 years up until that point, which was the silent, wordless prayer. So that's how I discovered centering prayer, and then I began exploring centering prayer for myself, and it just seemed to resonate with me, and it was easy for me to practice, and maybe it's not easy for everyone, and then you just need to find the right practice for you. But for me, it made sitting in silence easy, and it resonated with me, and I've continued, the practice since discovering it in late 2013. And then how you do it is, you sit comfortably with your eyes closed, and then to begin your time, you just introduce interiorly what we call a sacred word of 1 or 2 or 3 syllables. So it could be a color, it could be the beach, ocean, love, God, Jesus. Just kind of pick a word, and that signifies you're beginning your silent sit and you're opening to the presence and actions of God with Him. And then as you're sitting there, when you begin engaging your thoughts, and what I mean by that is when you begin thinking about all the things you did before your sit, or you begin thinking about an errand you might run after your sit, you realize you're really just sitting with yourself. You're not really sitting with God in the present moment. So you reintroduce interiorly that sacred word to bring yourself back to the present moment and let go of your engaged thoughts, and then let go of that sacred word. And you just do that when needed, just to keep bringing yourself back to the present moment and the purpose of your sit, of just sitting with God and letting go of your engaged thoughts. So that's how you do the practice. And you don't have to use a word. I quickly discovered I was more of an image person. So some people might use a word if they're auditory people. I discovered I'm more of a visual person, so I picture an interior image. Some people are more physical people, so they might use their breath to come back to the present moment. And then lastly, some people are afraid they'll fall asleep, so they don't close their eyes. They keep their eyes open, and they kind of keep their eyes focused on a spot 5 or 6 feet on the floor, perhaps, just to kind of keep them in the present moment. So that's a little bit about how you do centering prayer, and what it is and how I came across it.
And you have a book for those that want to delve more into this practice and your story, Sitting with God. Talk to me a little bit about this book and how it came about.
Amos Smith actually was the one that nudged me to write this book, because when I discovered his book in late 2013, I went to his website, emailed him, and we began a back and forth dialogue. I just began asking him lots of questions about centering prayer, and then we really just became friends, and I began initially doing work on his site and having a meditation off of his site until I created my own site, Silence Teaches, about 5 years ago. Actually, my same meditation that's Monday on my site goes off of his site on Mondays as well. So I began working with him, and he was the one that actually nudged me. He said, you ought to write a book. This is a practice that's been very meaningful and powerful for you. My book is probably a little bit more academic, and he was a pastor, and he said, you'd be coming from kind of a different perspective as an ordinary layperson, and he actually challenged me to write a book. So at that time, and that was about spring of 2014, at that time I thought it was crazy, but I'd never written anything more than 5 or 6 pages in school. I guess I never really had to do a whole lot of writing. I asked him, how do I do this? And he said, well, first just think about single sentence statements, what does centering prayer mean to you? So I did that. It took a week or two, sent him back an email with 14 or 15 single sentence statements. And then he said, there's the chapters, go write. Well, I decided just to pick one of the thoughts, take another 2 weeks or so, write 7, 8, 9, 10 pages and send it back to him just to see what he thought. And then I would just kind of go from there and decide whether he thinks I could write a book or is this horrible and let's scratch this idea. But to my surprise, he thought he enjoyed it. He thought it was fresh. And he said, you really need to continue. So I took him up on that challenge, and I spoke to my wife. I had kids at that time, too, and I didn't want to interfere with the family. So my wife encouraged me, yes, write your book. So I decided to get up. I disciplined myself on Saturday mornings, and this was pre-COVID. I would actually go to Starbucks at 6 a.m. in the morning, and I wrote from 6 to 9, 6 to 10 on Saturday mornings until the book got written. So that's really how the book came about. It was Amos Smith nudging me to write it, me trying one chapter, and then me realizing I think I can do this, and then really just a matter of disciplining myself to spend the time to write the book and not take away time from my family.
So let's go back to the beginnings of your life. Tell me where you were born and raised and kind of how the seeds of your spirituality and who you are today began.
I was born in New York City, lived there really just for 2 years, so I really don't remember New York City other than I've been to New York City. We moved to Pennsylvania when I was 2 at a small town called Warminster, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 miles north of Philadelphia in the suburbs. So I lived there until I was 18, and then at that point I went to the University of Pittsburgh to get my undergraduate degree. And then when I graduated, I went back home to live until I found a job. At that point, my parents had moved to Newtown, Pennsylvania, which was about 30 minutes from that location. So I lived at home, got a job, and then started dating, found a wife, and ended up buying a townhome and moving out. So that's a little bit about where I was. And then in terms of growing up, didn't really have a religion, to be honest with you. My mother passed away when I was 3 and a half. So if she had not passed away, we probably would have been Roman Catholic. She was Catholic. Her mother was Catholic. We probably would have grown up Catholic, but she passed away, and my father became Catholic when they got married. So then my father remarried about a year and a half after she passed away. And I remember when we were in middle school, we went to a Unitarian church for a bit. And that was really about it. And then I guess when I was in high school, I got invited to go to a youth group. So I was probably about 15, 16 years old. I had some friends that went to a Thursday night youth group at a local Baptist church, or backed by a local Baptist church. And they invited me to go, and I started going to that on Thursday nights. And that was a whole lot of fun, being with about 90 to 100 other kids. And they did a lot of Bible reading, but then they did a lot of fun things and skits, and then hung out afterwards. So that was kind of my exposure to God and the Bible. And then I went off to University of Pittsburgh, and I sort of stepped away from it all, to be honest with you, and enjoyed school, but worked hard in school, and then kind of came back to church. And when I got my first job out of school, my dad at that time with my mother, they had married many, many years prior to that. They had been going to the United Church of Christ, which was a kind of a progressive, liberal Protestant denomination. And they asked me to come, and I went, and I enjoyed it. So I'm in between churches now, but I spent 20 years at the United Church of Christ, which I really enjoyed that church, because they were very open, they were very inclusive, and they let you come as you are, wherever you were at with your faith. They didn't bang things over your head, and they didn't criticize people, and they weren't critical of people. They were very welcome of people wherever you were at with your faith and what you believe.
I think the interesting thing about spirituality and God I've experienced in my life is that there's these flashpoints. Like, you have faith, but there's things that are shown to you in life. And I know one of the moments, I have a handful of them, one of them specifically was seeing something like the Grand Canyon. Like, it's an indelible moment on this planet where you're like, there's no possible way that just happened. And, there's been some others, be a dream from old friends that I lost when I was a teenager, and other things that have happened to me. But I'm curious, because people that are skeptical of theology and spirituality always want some level of empiricism. So I'm curious, in your life, what was one of the first moments that happened to you that made you think there's no possible way that wasn't divinely brought to me, or there's not a level of this that is proof that there's a God?
I would say for me, it was when I began practicing centering prayer. So I began practicing in late 2013, and then really seriously practicing it June 2014, moving forward. And I don't talk about, actually I did mention this in the book, but people would think you're crazy. But I remember for work, and this was in 2016, I had to go to New York City for work. I took the train, and I went up the day before with meeting on Monday, and I went up Sunday afternoon. And I remember I loved just to walk in the city, and I remember walking to Union Park, I think was the name of the park, and I was sitting there. And as I was sitting there, all of a sudden, life was loud and vibrant. And it wasn't just because it was in the city, and it was almost overwhelming. And I was just sitting there, and I just thought, what is going on? This is almost too much coming at. It was like life was bouncing at me in all different directions, and I didn't know what was going on.
Rich, are you there? If you can hear me, I think I may have lost you for a minute. Okay, can you hear me okay, Rich?
Yes.
Okay, so just for context, and when I was explaining that before, I didn't have it recording. I just want to make sure that I'm recording this, and just to let you know that was really rather magnanimous in my mind. You were right at a point where you were saying the lights were bright, the reception on our phone was totally fine, nothing was going on, and all of a sudden you went away. I moved thinking the reception was strange, and you ended up having to call me back. So let's kind of, so, I mean, however you want to take that in the middle of this interview, to me, it's rather, magnanimous that something like that possibly could be a part of this. Not saying it is, just saying that you're explaining the lights were going bright. So if you want to pick up from there, hopefully we don't lose reception and we can continue on.
So I remember I was sitting in Union Park, and all of a sudden it just seemed very bright out and vibrant, but it also seemed loud, and I felt like life was kind of bouncing off of me with its brightness and sounds, and it was just a kind of an overwhelming feeling, and I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't even know how to explain this to people, nor I'm not sure I wanted to, because I thought people may think I was crazy, but it was like life was bouncing at me very strongly, and I didn't know what was going on, and it was kind of neat, and then all of a sudden it was too much, and I kind of wanted it to go away. And after about 15 minutes, it did calm down, and I didn't really know what had just happened, other than I was thinking perhaps God simply wanted me to experience as much of life and vibrant life that is possible. Actually, I remember even, I mentioned David Smith earlier, I actually called him and said, I can safely talk to you. I didn't know what had happened here, but this is what I just experienced while sitting in Union Park in New York City. So that was just kind of a neat experience where I definitely thought God was trying to communicate something to me about life and how much if you open up to it, you can experience things that you've never experienced before. So I think God wanted me to experience life bouncing off of me in many different capacities. And I think it happened. I mean, it happened one other time, but not to that extent. I was in our cul-de-sac one afternoon playing with my kids, and I remember my son was riding his bike, and my daughter and I were just having a catch with the tennis ball, and it wasn't loudness, but it was super bright, and I knew I was hydrated, and I knew I had plenty to eat, and I didn't know what was going on, and it was 5 or 10 minutes, and then it was kind of less bright. So it was a similar experience, but not as intense. And you don't know what to make of these. And then I haven't had any other experience like both of those in a number of years. But something happened, and I guess I'm still processing it. And I mentioned it in my book.
Oh yeah, I don't find that far-flung at all. I find that very logical. As I think there's a lot of things that happen in our lives that tend to get dismissed as too fantastical, but I think it's definitely within the realm of possibility. I always think when it comes to levels of spirituality and intellect, we only use a very small capacity of our brain power. And I'm always fascinated by what would open up if we actually even used half of what is capable in our brains.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right. There's a whole inner world within us that we can open to. And that's what I like about my practice centering prayer. I mean, maybe as I continue to practice centering prayer, I'm going to be open to more and neat things, and notice things that I never noticed before, hear things or see things or feel things that I never noticed before, because I'm more aware and I'm more present, and I've missed them in the past.
Yeah. So who would you consider, heroes in your life or mentors?
That's a good question. I guess probably just from the spiritual path, Thomas Keating was really the founder of Contemplative Outreach, which is really the main centering prayer organization. So he and 2 other Trappist monks in the early 70s kind of put together centering prayer and began teaching it to clergy and and then lay people, then creating the Contemplative Outreach Organization in 1984. And it has a website, contemplativeoutreach.org, and then you can go on it and get a ton of resources on centering prayer and find groups that practice in the U.S. and internationally, all over the place. So I would say Thomas Keating, just kind of listening to him talk he passed away a couple of years ago, but listening to him talk on YouTube videos, reading his books, and just getting kind of the power of silence and what a long-term practice can do for you. So he definitely is, he just had a very good way of just explaining what happens in the silence and what he has experienced in the the 80, probably the 70, 80 years of silent practice that he's been doing. So he's been a huge influence, just to read his books and just to listen to, any of the talks or past podcasts he's been on or videos that he's done. He's just been a neat resource just to listen to.
So when you were a kid, what was your dream that you wanted to be when you grew up?
And I still remember this. I remember I was in middle school and I had to actually give a speech on it. I loved photography, so I wanted to be a Sports Illustrated photographer. And that never happened, but I did do photography as a hobby, and I remember researching 35 millimeter cameras and then buying one and then learning how to take pictures. And I also learned how to do, now we're in the digital age, but back then it was film, and I took in middle school, we could develop black and white film, so I took pictures, learned how to develop. So I guess at that time I thought I was going to be a Sports Illustrated photographer.
So if you could meet anybody on the planet right now, anybody that's alive, who would you love to meet and talk to?
That's awesome. And some of these people have passed away, but like Desmond Tutu and Thomas Keating or Gandhi, they're all, I guess, not completely answering your question, but these were kind of amazing people that just had a power and presence and could just move millions, if not billions, of people just by their actions and the way they did things. So the three of them have passed away, but I guess it would have been neat if I could have met or been in the presence of any one of those three, just because of the way they carried themselves, the strong presence they had, the way they could lead people, the way they loved and cared and were compassionate toward people. So even sometimes just sitting in the presence of people, like, for example, Thomas Keating, I heard people say, because he had practiced, silence for decades, they were just sitting in his presence. There was just something about even being in his presence. It's like he glowed, and you could feel the spiritual power resonating off of him.
I believe it, and one of the other things that I do is, I interview jazz musicians, and I remember the one time that happened was the organ Hammond B3 master, Dr. Lonnie Smith, who was a deeply spiritual individual. I remember getting off the phone, and it took a while for me to just kind of shake off how unbelievable that experience was. I mean, he transcended any level of just speaking to a regular person on this planet. It was rather spectral. So yeah, those kinds of things are wonderful for sure. So for all things concerning your book and your life and anything that's coming up, all things Rich Lewis, where can folks go to get your book and to see more about you and your silence and prayer practice?
Sure. The easiest place to find me is my website, silenceteaches.com. When they come there, I offer a free ebook on centering prayer for those that want to learn more about what is this practice. It's a very short, easy ebook to read in 5 minutes or so. And then if they want to further explore it, my book, Sitting with God, A Journey to Your True Self Through Centering Prayer, is on my website. If you're a group and want me to come talk with your group, I have an Invite Me to Speak page. I do a lot of that. And then if you're someone that just wants to either begin the practice or you're already practicing and need some help with your practice, I offer one-on-one coaching. So my website, silenceteaches.com, is really the best place to find me and connect with me.
Beautiful. Rich, so I will tell you one thing before we get off the phone. This week, I kind of commemorated my 2000th interview since I kind of began doing these in earnest in 2011. And speaking of our conversation kind of ending in the middle of a pretty magnanimous story from you, The only other time I've ever had anything on the phone that could be akin to that, I was talking to somebody, I believe they were in LA, and we were interviewing, and I kept hearing these kids in the background. And I thought he was in a park. He was with this kid. It happens, and it's fine that there's ambient noise. And it just kept going, and then it got more and more defined, and we both kind of stopped. And I said, is everything okay? Are you good? And he kind of stopped, and he said, well, are you okay? And I was like, yeah, everything's fine. I said, you have kids there. Do you want to take a break? And he was like, there's no children around me right now. I thought that was from you. And I was like, no, it's not on my end. So I was like, we both kind of were like, wow. So we just figured that maybe there was ambient noise. We didn't know what was going on. So I said, let me hang up and call you back. We hung up. I called him back. There was no sounds. So I don't know what happened, but we were both like, wow, that was wild. So
that's true. That's true. Wow.
I would have to rank what we just went through kind of up in that echelon of things, but in a good way. So
right.
There was definitely something going on, and I find it ironic that what you were talking about is connecting with God through silence, and when you started explaining that story, we went into complete silence together.
Right. And I didn't do anything because my phone was lying flat on I didn't touch anything. All of a sudden, you were gone, and I'm like, I was talking, and I realized I think I'm just talking to myself.
Yeah, and it was just silent. I didn't do anything either. So at any rate, that was rather, that was kind of a moment in the middle of everything. So Rich, hey, thank you for opening up. Thanks for talking to me about this. It's a fascinating practice, and I think that, the one thing that this planet that I find interesting over this COVID time is that in our silence, we cleaned up the air quality. The Venice Canal actually got clear. I think it's a metaphor for the human race for that time. I think there was a lot of clarity, and what you're doing is wonderful, and I think that people would really, really benefit by what you were doing and what you have put out there into the world.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun. And yes, I encourage people just to try. Even a little bit of silence is better than no silence. We all need to take at least a daily dose of silence. It can do amazing things for you.
Absolutely, I agree. Rich, hey, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, religion, literature, and music around the globe. Most music on these episodes comes from the great Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino in the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at YouTube, and for everything related to Joe Dimino, go to joedimino.com, and when you're there, you can donate via PayPal or Patreon. Until next time.